rightly shepherd lectures with regard to good and evil, old problems in the new century. Maybe by the time we finish at the end of March, this is our spring series, maybe it really will be spring by then. Before we get started, I want to mention two things. First is the weather. I don't know why I thought of that today. Even though we're not at the high school, the adult schools policy on weather closings will still do that. That is, if Princeton regional schools are closed because of weather, and that's when they announce either classes or after-school activities are closed, the adult school will be closed. The canceled lecture would be made up at the end. School closings are announced on local radio. They're posted immediately on the regional school's website. It will be on our answering machine and on our website, which is PrincetonAdultSchool.org. And they're posted on local television channel 14, which is the regional schools channel. All of these with phone numbers are noted in your brochure. Canceling classes, as you might suspect, is a real pain in the neck. So we would appreciate it if you would all pray for good weather for the next 5 Tuesdays. The other thing I want to mention tonight is the taping. As you can see, the adult school is taping these lectures, and we've done that for the past few years. Yulia Zaks from TV Channel 30, our local public access television, is doing the taping. After all 7 lectures are over and the tapes have all been completed and copied, the adult school will make them available to Channel 30, which will air them, and we will donate a set to the Princeton Public Library and the Mercer County Library. A complication this year is that the Princeton Library has asked us not to give them anything until they have moved back downtown. They don't want to move anything they don't have to. So at their request, or maybe their insistence, we're holding any tapes that have been completed since late last summer. The Mercer County Library, on the other hand, isn't going anywhere, and all the tapes from all the series, including Utopias, which was just this fall, are available there. And you can, by the way, get them interlibrary loan from Princeton Public Library. Now, the subject at hand. When we were putting this series together on ethical issues, we wanted to have both theoreticians and practitioners represented. In tonight's speaker, we have someone who appears to have a foot in both camps. Evan Thomas, a graduate of Harvard College and the University of Virginia Law School, is Ferris Visiting Professor of Journalism and Stewart Professor of Media and Public Policy at Princeton University. In his day job, he is Assistant Managing Editor of Newsweek magazine. As such, he is the magazine's lead writer on major news stories and the author of many longer features. After starting his career, I thought it was Time magazine. He tells me tonight that it was at the Newark Star Picture of the Bergen Record. The Bergen Record, living above a deli. He served for 10 years as the Washington Bureau Chief for Newsweek before becoming in 1991 the Assistant Managing Editor. If he looks or sounds familiar to you, it may be because he has been a regular weekly panelist on Inside Washington and is a frequent guest on other radio and TV shows as a commentator. He was Newsweek's lead writer on the Iraq War and continues to write major stories on intelligence and national security. In 2002, he was honored with the prestigious National Magazine Award for General Excellence. In addition to his journalistic writing, Mr. Thomas is the author of 5 books, including the New York Times best-selling biography of John Paul Jones, published in 2003. I wonder where he finds time to do all this. We are fortunate indeed to have him in Princeton just when we needed him. He's going to talk with us tonight about a subject that could hardly be more timely: the press and press.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be in Princeton. I'm teaching here this year, and I love it for lots of reasons, but one is just the beauty of the place. Every day, even February can't dim Princeton's beauty. Well, not that much, but it really is a gorgeous place, and I'm happy and honored to be here. I'm going to talk tonight about the presidency and the press and complicated ethical issues, and I'm focusing mainly on this mystery of the WMD. Where are those weapons of mass destruction? Why can't we find them? Why didn't we find them? Why did our leaders tell us that they were in Iraq? What happened here? Was the president lying? Was he hyping? Did the CIA just miss it? Is it just bad intelligence? And how about the press? Did we miss the boat here? Were we somehow taken for a ride? Why didn't we do our jobs? But first, I think I'll start with a relevant story. This is the transcript of a conversation released by the Chief of Naval Operations on October 10th, 1995, between a British ship and the Irish Coast Guard. Irish, please divert your course 15 degrees to the south to avoid a collision. British, recommend you divert your course 15 degrees to the north to avoid a collision. Irish, negative, you will have to divert your course 15 degrees to the south to avoid a collision. British, this is the captain of a British Navy ship. I say again, divert your course. Irish, negative, I say again, you will have to divert your course. British, this is the aircraft carrier HMS Britannia, the second largest ship in the British Atlantic Fleet. We were accompanied by 3 destroyers, 3 cruisers, and numerous support vessels. Demand that you change your course 15 degrees north. I say again that it's 15 degrees north, or countermeasures will be undertaken to ensure the safety of this ship. Irish, we are a lighthouse. Your call. There are 2 morals to this story. One of them is arrogance, or as the Greeks called it, hubris, which will get you into trouble every time. And the other is assumption. We have a rule in journalism that assumption is the mother of error. Pretty much anytime we just assume something, it turns out to be wrong. And arrogance and assumption are at the heart of what went wrong on WMD. First of all, a bit of background, or as we say in journalism, the backstory, which you need to, the context that you need, I think, to understand what happened here. And the place to start is with a word on intelligence. The history of intelligence is largely failure. If you think about it, intelligence services routinely get it wrong. Even the Israelis, who are particularly good at it, missed the '67 war until it was on top of them, and then they did it again in '73. Our own intelligence services failed to see the collapse of the Soviet Union, pretty big thing to happen. They missed Pearl Harbor. Of course, they missed 9/11. They've been missing things for a long time. So have most intelligence services. The Brits are proud of their intelligence, but I'm reminded of the story of a longtime British intelligence officer whose career spanned nearly the entire 20th century. And he said in the course of his career he was wrong only twice, World War I and World War II. Now the problem here is, to be a little bit flip about it, we've seen too many movies. Fiction and movies have painted the idea of all-knowing intelligence services who can peer down through satellites and people running around in trench coats, and they just do things that intelligence services cannot do in real life. Spying, or HUMINT as they call it, human intelligence, is really hard to do. You are basically persuading somebody else to betray their country for cash or other motivations, and you're hoping that person is reliable, having been dishonest and betrayed their country, is going to reliably tell you something that you need to know. It often doesn't work out. During the course of the Cold War, it's significant to me that the CIA used to refer to the Soviet Union and China as the denied territories. Denied them. We didn't even have a station chief in Moscow until 1956. The first station chief lasted 1 month until the Russians trapped him in what they call a honey trap. They set him up with a prostitute and kicked him out of the country after 1 month. We didn't really start penetrating the KGB until towards the end of the Cold War. We had maybe half a dozen useful spies all during the 50s, 60s, and into the 70s. If we were unsuccessful with the Soviet Union, we've done even less well in the Arab world. for a lot of reasons, language problems being one of them. We just don't have enough Arab speakers. But it is pretty hard to penetrate a world that is that alien to us, certainly to penetrate terrorist groups, where you pretty much have to be a terrorist to be a member of one, and often a clan member, a family member. We've had a notable lack of success. We really didn't have, it turns out, probably any good spies in Baghdad, or I mean good spies. We may have had some intelligence, but we really didn't have any very good spies. And that's one reason why we didn't find the WMD, because we just didn't have any spies. We didn't have any good spies. I'll get to the bad spies in a second. There's nothing new about that. It's just that our assumptions, our public assumptions, and the assumptions of policymakers are that the CIA can do more than, in fact, it has historically been able to accomplish. One significant exception to that I will point out is that we're very good at technical intelligence. Our spy satellites. We did have success in the Cold War counting Soviet missiles and tanks. And in the Cuban Missile Crisis, significantly. We saw those missiles, the U-2 spy planes, saw those missiles in Cuba and allowed President Kennedy to do something to get them out of there. So we have had technical successes, and we used to be able to eavesdrop very well. That's gotten harder in the age of digital. It's easier to encrypt now. There's some feeling that the National Security Agency, also known as no such agency because it's so secret, is going deaf. Is having a harder time listening in on the phone conversations of our enemies. For a long time, we were able to listen to bin Laden talk to his mother until somebody printed that in the papers. And then we weren't able to anymore. He stopped using his cell phone. So there is an important exception for technical means, but not so much for human means. And unfortunately, you can have all the satellites you want, but if you're trying to find something as small as a vial of biological, of some bugs or germs, you really need human intelligence to get in there. No spy satellite's going to get that for you. The other problem here is that the customers of the intelligence community have the same assumptions that the CIA is able to do great things, or at least presidents often do. They think often presidents have looked at the CIA as somebody who can do something quick and cheap and dirty without mobilizing battalions and having to go to war. Gee, can't the CIA do this for us without anybody really knowing about it? Eisenhower was delighted when the CIA was able to overthrow the government of Guatemala and install the Shah of Iran in the early 50s, because he, having been a military man, knew how hard it was to mobilize military forces and to win wars, and he knew the limits of military action, and he was glad to have the CIA do it for him. Well, they did it successfully a couple of times, but not so successfully thereafter. The Bay of Pigs comes to mind, an operation that got going under Eisenhower. And for years, presidents have been disappointed. They often get sort of sucked in. They get what they call the President's Daily Briefing. Every morning before breakfast, an intelligence officer in this administration, the chief intelligence officer, the head of the CIA, George Tenet, goes to the White House with a briefing book that's been prepared overnight, and presidents love it because at first they love it because it's full of gossip. We may not be able to overhear what Al-Qaeda's doing, but we can overhear what the French government's up to, and there are little tidbits in there, often salacious tidbits, that amuse presidents and give the feeling or the aura of omniscience by the CIA. It's misleading, but it is tantalizing to presidents who think that they're getting the inside skinny and the feeling that they're really going to get the inside look every morning before breakfast. I've heard it said that presidents over time realize that they're really not getting the inside story and grow tired of their president's daily briefing. I don't think that's happened with President Bush and Asian terror, but it has happened to earlier presidents who just got tired of reading gossip, but missing what they really wanted to know and finding out that they would give an order saying, I want to know this, and nothing would come back because we just couldn't get it. But you have presidents demanding, and you have this further problem of the customer coloring what he or she is getting by demanding a little bit too eagerly. Now, the intelligence services are supposed to be independent. That's one of their essential criteria, is that they're supposed to be apolitical, above politics, beyond politics. But they're human beings, after all. And when, say, the vice president shows up and starts asking questions that have a certain inflection, it's just human that the analysts are going to tell the customer, the policymaker, what he or she wants to hear. There's also this problem that all analysts have of worst-case scenarios. Put yourself in the shoes of a CIA analyst. If you predict something good is going to happen, or at least something bad's not going to happen, and it goes wrong, you're in a lot more trouble than if you say that something terrible is going to happen and it doesn't go wrong. I mean, it's always safer to bet on the worst case. If you guess wrong, if you say, well, the Arabs are not going to attack, or Al-Qaeda is not going to attack, and they do, you're going to be hiring a lawyer and testifying before congressional committees. So the natural tendency of analysts is to put out worst-case scenarios, to assume the worst, and that, of course, is at least one of the things that happened here in now well-known 2002 National Intelligence Estimate, which said with a high degree of certainty that the Iraqis had stockpiles of chemical and biological weapons and were at work on a nuclear weapon. Part of that was just classic worst-case scenario, telling their customers what they wanted to hear. Now, an additional problem here was that some of the customers were suspicious of the CIA, didn't really like the CIA, important customers. Donald Rumsfeld, the Secretary of Defense, and Vice President Cheney. They have a history. During the Cold War, they were known as Team Bers. Rumsfeld was actually on Team B. As some of you may recall, in the mid-'70s, the Hawks began challenging CIA assessments of Soviet strength. And the Hawks believed that the CIA was undercounting Soviet warheads. And so they put together a separate Team B to do their own analysis. And Team B was actually right. The CIA was undercounting Soviet warheads. And that Team B experience strengthened the skepticism of Rumsfeld and Cheney to make them doubt the CIA analysts and assume that things were actually worse than the intelligence analysts were telling them. It's an important bit of background because Cheney and Rumsfeld are pretty powerful people, and when they're full of doubt about the intelligence, that also colors things and makes the intelligence analysts a little more nervous and uneasy and eager to please, and maybe shading their opinions a little bit more to suit them. It also had another consequence, which is that in the Defense Department, the government has lots of intelligence agencies. There's not just the CIA, there's the DIA, and there's the NSA, and there are reconnaissance offices, and each of the military branches has an intelligence service. And in the Rumsfeld Defense Department, there was yet another intelligence branch created sort of spontaneously out of I think it was the Near Eastern Intelligence Unit suddenly created this Office of Special Projects, which was a little tiny mini CIA, or at least analytical branch, and they began analyzing their own intelligence. And where did they get it? They got it from defectors, from Iraqi defectors. There's a great skepticism about defectors generally in the intelligence community. The CIA likes to say that defectors tell you 150% of what they know, and it's because often they want a safe house or a job, or they want something, asylum. So the CIA is skeptical about defectors, but not the Defense Department. The Defense Department was believing defectors, and they were particularly believing one, the person who was sending them the defectors, Ahmed Chalabi, who, as many of you know, was a businessman, a banker convicted of fraud, actually, in Jordan, who was living in London, had last been in Iraq in the 1950s, but had visions of coming back as the government in exile and becoming the ruler of Iraq. And he had a strong vested interest in proving that Saddam was keeping biological and chemical weapons, and proving that Saddam was a mortal threat to the United States, because if he could prove that, the United States was more likely to invade Iraq and get rid of Saddam. So Chalabi had a real motive for presenting worst-case intelligence to the Defense Department. There should have been a higher level of skepticism about Chalabi's defectors, but there wasn't. Why? Because President Bush, but certainly, President Bush, but certainly Rumsfeld and Cheney, from the get-go, wanted to go to war. Why did they want to go to war? I think the clearest answer to that I ever got as a journalist came when I went to see Secretary Rumsfeld in December 2001. This is after 9/11, but long before we went to war in Iraq. And he was talking to me. He said that when he was chosen as Secretary of Defense in January of 2001, he had gone to President-elect Bush and said, the word is out around the world that the United States has gone soft, that we're a paper tiger, that the bad guys aren't taking us seriously anymore, that we can't take a punch, and that the crisis is going to come, Mr. President, and I'm going to come to you and say that we have to lean forward. I use that expression, lean forward, and do something to show the world that we are tough, that we're not just going to take things lying down. And as Rumsfeld told me this story, he said, and sure enough, the crisis came on 9/11, and I went to the president, and he said, okay, let's go. And they did, into Afghanistan. But that was not enough. They wanted a demonstration project of the will of the United States that would show the Arab world and just about everybody else that just how tough we were. This sounds kind of crude, almost atavistic, but I believe that it is at the heart of why we went to war in Iraq, because WMD doesn't explain it. Humanitarian impulses don't explain it. Getting rid of tyrants, that really doesn't explain it either. The real reason we went to war in Iraq was to show firmness, to erase the memory of pulling out of Somalia, pulling out of Lebanon, of being less than forceful in Haiti, of trying to fight a war from 15,000 feet in Bosnia, a long list of perceived weakness by the United States in the eyes of, certainly of Cheney and Rumsfeld, and I believe the president made them want to show the world that we were tougher than that. And so they needed some evidence to justify that, and they willed fairly weak evidence to make a case. They're not the first policymakers to do this. After World War II, when the Soviet Union was coming on, Dean Acheson, Secretary of State, and his cohort hyped the Soviet threat. They made a Soviet invasion of Western Europe seem a lot more imminent than it was. The Soviets were actually tearing up railroad track, so we didn't invade them. If you listen to the pronouncements of the United States government in 1947, 1948, the Soviets were about to attack at any moment. Now, I'm not minimizing the Soviet threat. I do think the Soviets were a threat, and I think in many ways the Western Alliance and the work of Dean Acheson was thoroughly admirable in facing that threat. But it is also true that they exaggerated the nature of the threat. Dean Acheson had an expression for it. He said, sometimes you have to make things clearer than the truth. And that's what happened in Iraq. Now, one little footnote on that, academic footnote. When I was talking to Cheney's people, they were enamored with Bernard Lewis, a Princeton professor. I guess is he still a professor? He may be emeritus. But they read Bernard Lewis to justify their theory of force. As they read Lewis, I think this may be a misreading or simplistic reading, But as they read Bernard Lewis, the message was that the Arabs only respect force, that you really got to punch them in the nose to get their attention. And this academic justification was cited to me again and again. In fact, they had Lewis in there, I think, to talk to them. They may be distorting and warping a more subtle and nuanced and complex academic view, but it was interesting to me how they used the academy to justify, for their own purposes, to give them, as it were, intellectual justification for what they were doing. Now, you might fairly ask, where was the press in all this? Where was I? Where were my colleagues? Because we didn't blow the whistle very loudly. If you go back and look at it, there were rumbles of doubt from the press, but they weren't all that loud. And part of it, again, is the nature of intelligence. I've done lots of reporting over the years on different things, and the hardest thing is intelligence, because it's secret. They're not supposed to tell us. CIA officials are put on lie detector tests. The least leaky place in Washington is the CIA. Most of the intelligence reporting that I've gotten over the years has come off the Hill, the intelligence committees, or out of the State Department, or out of the Defense Department, very rarely out of the agency itself. And when it is, it's usually authorized. It's usually a top-down leak authorized by the director. It's not some desk officer or some agent spilling the beans. That just doesn't happen that much, or it doesn't happen to us at Newsweek, and I don't really think it happens elsewhere. I can usually tell by reading the paper where people are getting their information, we've actually had more stuff out of the CIA in recent years, but it's all been authorized top-down stuff. So we just don't know a whole lot, and it makes us, puts us in the position of being supplicants. We're sort of always scratching around and begging for handouts, and we fall prey to this desire for access, which makes us easier to manipulate, because we're coming with our hat in our hand and sort of begging for any little scrap they can give us, and the clever ones are good at manipulating us and giving us only that information which they wish to give us. After all, the whole idea of disinformation is a tactic of the intelligence community, and I don't think that the CIA consciously disinforms us. I think they may, but it's pretty rare, because there are consequences to if you get caught lying too often by the press. And in our system, it goes badly for you. But they're selective in what they tell us. Now, interestingly, we did get glimpses of real friction between the CIA and the Defense Department. I was shocked talking to a very high-ranking Defense Department official, I remember before the Iraq War, who was just excoriating the CIA for being too cautious and too full of doubt about defectors and not gung-ho enough. And I was really struck. I hung up the phone and I said, why is this senior person in the Defense Department saying and denigrating our intelligence service to a reporter? That this is not a close friend of mine. This is somebody I think I've met twice in my life. And it was a little disturbing just as a citizen. I remember thinking to myself, if I was a citizen listening to this conversation, I'd be a little bothered that the top of the Defense Department is as critical of the CIA as they are. And we duly noted these tensions. In the pages of Newsweek, we did reflect these tensions. But it was murky and unclear and extremely difficult to judge who was right. Whether the skeptics of the CIA were right, or whether the hawks and the gung-ho types of the Defense Department were right. There's a further condition here that I think affected all of us. Although the normal status of a reporter is a skeptic, after 9/11 things did change a little bit, and for the better in some ways. I can recall in August 2001, covering this ludicrous Gary Condit scandal. Do you remember that at all? I mean, one of the most ridiculous stories that I've been involved in. Here we were tarring this poor congressman. I mean, I don't think he's a great guy, but making him seem like a murderer when we, had evidence that he was sort of a scuzzy guy, but nothing to tie him to a murder. And this scandal was going on and on. And I can remember being as a summer guest on, it was then called This Week with Sam and Cokie. And Cokie Roberts was just ritually sort of trashing Gary Condit without even thinking about it, just reflexively. It was week 8 or something of the scandal. And I found myself inexplicably defending Gary Condit, just out of sheer perversity, for the amusement of it, or just to do something different. And I walked out, and I remember thinking to myself, maybe I'll start my teaching career a little bit early. And this is August 2001. Well, they started flying into buildings a month later, and my life just completely changed. I went from covering stupid scandals to life and death issues of intelligence and war and terror, and I was just as scared as everybody else, but it was tremendously fulfilling and interesting and exhausting, but important. I mean, it felt like we were doing something important. But we were scared. I actually saw the Pentagon get hit. It was all sort of close to home. I was looking out my window. I overlooked the Pentagon, and there it was on that morning. So things changed a little bit. We were less skeptical than we had been, a little bit less jaundiced, a little bit less irreverent about things. And I kind of was glad of it at the time, that we wrote in a more uncritical way, perhaps, even in some ways jingoistic or patriotic way. I've gone back and looked at some of my 9/11 coverage, and it's pretty flag-waving. In fact, I had my class at Princeton read one of my stories, and they criticized me for being too patriotic. That's the first time that's ever happened. That journalists are being criticized for waving the flag too much. So we were creatures of that time and that place, and it made us, I think, made me less skeptical, and I think it made my colleagues less skeptical. Now, another factor that has to do with this presidency is that the Bush presidency is about the most secretive presidency I've ever covered, and I've been doing this. I got into journalism in the Carter administration, so I've seen a number of administrations, and it's generally true that Democrats blab more than Republicans, but even by the generally buttoned-up standard of Republicans, this is really a tight-lipped administration. That's partly because Bush is efficient, he believes in loyalty, he really makes a point of telling his aides to keep their mouths shut, he doesn't want to read about it in the paper, and he doesn't feel the need that his predecessor, Bill Clinton, had to be in the paper all the time. One journalist once described President Bush as the A4 president, meaning that he was content to be on page A4 as opposed to A1. It was a shrewd calculus, really. I think that Clinton got caught up. Remember Clinton's war room and Carville and Stephanopoulos, this whole idea that you have to answer every allegation and you can never miss a news cycle without responding. The White House got swept up in this wave of counter strikes against any allegation, and they were riding a tiger. I think it's a chump's game for the White House to try to stay ahead of the story, stay ahead of the press, because the press controls the story ultimately. And I think the Clinton administration got unduly swept up in trying to answer every little allegation. Bush initially had a different approach, which was, we're going to just hang back a little bit. I'm the president. I can control the pulpit anytime I want. I just have to step out into the press room, and the cameras are going to go on. But I don't have to be on page 1 every single day. And a lot of stories are just little Washington stories that most of the country really doesn't care about. Let the Washington folks flap around. The rest of the country won't care. And then when it gets serious, I will address the issue. And that was, I think, quite a shrewd strategy by President Bush. And it lasted a long time, but it was tough on my business because we just didn't know as much. There were some important selective leaks. Bob Woodward is very good at getting inside the tent. But those were the top-down leaks where they were authorized by the president to get their story out. Bob Woodward's book, Bush at War, which is one of the only inside accounts, was authorized by Bush. He gave permission to his aides to leak. But that was very unusual. And close readers of the New York Times and the Washington Post know that you're learning less from the papers about the true inside doings of the White House than you have in prior administrations. So that was also a factor. Now, of course, some of that shrewdness seems like arrogance, that Bush was just trying to float above the fray, and maybe that wasn't such a good idea. And in fact, things are changing a little bit. I noted 2 Friday nights ago when Bush put out all those records on his National Guard duty. That was very Clinton-esque. The Friday 6:30 p.m. dump, when I just put all the documents out and try to bury you, to bury you in records. And that was very un-Bushian and very Clinton-esque, and it showed a low level of panic in the White House. They're reading those polls. They see them 8, 9, 10 points down to Kerry. Now maybe that's a temporary phenomenon, but it's worrying the White House, and they're behaving a little bit differently now. They're a little bit more panicky and a little bit more open as a result, or at least they're trying to get their story out a little bit. They're a little less smug and secure, and a little bit more eager to please. Now the other thing that's going to happen here, because of this, is there already are, I think, 5 separate investigations into the CIA, into what went wrong here. And as a member of the press, I should welcome this because it's going to produce stories, and we're going to learn more. And as an historian, I should be glad of it because it's going to unearth documents and produce reports that I can use in future books. But I can tell you, as a citizen, I am a little bit more nervous about it. A lot of these investigations can be just counterproductive. They tend to demoralize the CIA and make the analysts even jumpier and less secure. CIA officials spend all their time testifying before Congress. Mid-level government officials are hiring lawyers. It drives some of them out of government. It certainly is tough on their morale, and morale is an issue here. You don't want to demoralize Central Intelligence Agency. So I think all these investigations are not necessarily a good idea. I think what we need, frankly, in intelligence is a couple of things. One is time. It takes a long time to penetrate denied areas. It took us a long time to get inside the Soviet Union. It's going to take us a long time to get inside Al-Qaeda. And we have to give the intelligence services time to slowly nurture sources and get the language skills and get inside. And it takes money. I mean, basically, we buy intelligence. In fact, most ordinary people just don't realize that most of our intelligence is either bought directly or, more typically, we're giving bags of cash to other intelligence services, to Jordan, Egypt. I mean, a lot of our intelligence, I'm sorry to say, is very indirect. We are buying the take of an Arab service, an Arab Mukhbarat or an Arab internal security service, and that's a mixed bag because those services have a better shot than we do. The Jordanians are better at getting inside terror groups than we are. On the other hand, you never know if they're giving you everything, and it's sometimes hard to evaluate, and it's murky and tricky. It's sort of better if you have your own case officers working their own assets inside rather than simply paying for whatever the Egyptians tell you or rather wish to tell you. But it takes time to grow our own, and CIA sort of hit a low point in the mid-90s. It's been working back since then, pre-9/11. They were starting to spend more money. Congress was spending more money on intelligence, but it takes years. They tell me, 8, 9, 10 years to really develop a good case officer, and so we still have a ways to go. So what the CIA really needs is not to be investigated endlessly or move around the boxes on the flow chart, but time and money to get better at what they're doing, and also a dose of reality, not just for the CIA, but for the rest of us, on what intelligence can and cannot accomplish. Now, I want to stress here, by saying that intelligence is tough to do and we have to have low expectations, I don't mean to diminish the importance of it. Because in the war on terror, when you think about it, it's the first and just about the last line of defense. Giant armies aren't going to do the trick. I mean, yes, they can send a message to Al-Qaeda, I guess, by deposing Saddam. But basically, when you're dealing with a secretive foe that operates in cells and lives in caves, you really are dependent on your intelligence gathering. I mean, that's what stands between us and 9/11, or much worse. So it really matters what the CIA does. This is not an idle issue, not something to be toyed with. We really need a strong intelligence service, however uncomfortable that makes us in a democracy which believes in openness and freedom. I'm sorry to say the truth is we just need a secret service that knows what it's doing and can operate with a relative degree of secrecy. At the same time, we need to have customers and consumers who are realistic about what they're getting, who don't fall prey to those twin evils of arrogance and assumption. Thank you very much.
Even if they had the greatest number of Arabic experts and the most wonderful wizards in intelligence, it seems they were not going to find weapons of mass destruction.
That's true, but they might have written a national intelligence estimate in October of 2002 that says there are none.
Would that have been accepted by the leadership?
Well, that's the question, but if they had better, I think one of the reasons why they wrote that document is that they didn't really know, but they didn't want to admit it. They weren't really willing to come clean with their own bosses about how little they knew. There were a lot of assumptions built in there that turned out not to be true, but that's what they were. They were assumptions. If we really had good human intelligence inside of Iraq, I think the intelligence makers would have been compelled to tell policymakers, you know, we have good people inside, and they're saying that there isn't anything there. Now, you could say, well, Bush wouldn't have accepted that either. But my own feel for this is that if the intelligence people are giving you that kind of hard intelligence, it's hard even for the most wishful, arrogant, willful manipulator in the vice president's office to then turn around and say, never mind, we're sure the stuff is there, we're going in there anyways. They have to pay some attention. They can't just totally disregard the intelligence. The problem was that the intelligence services just didn't have good intelligence. There were defectors telling them that there was stuff there. There's a CIA sort of hemming and hawing, and well, we think it's there based on what we knew from the past and prior UN inspections, but we're not really sure, but we think there is. I mean, that kind of dancing around, and Cheney and Rumsfeld took that ball and ran with it.
Can I just add one
Yeah, of
thing?
course.
There were some pretty highly regarded people like Scott Ritter running around. I heard him on public television and places stating flatly that the inspectors who were in there had determined that Saddam didn't have these weapons.
Scott Ritter, for reasons that are not clear to me, was not regarded as a credible person by the intelligence community. They didn't, I forget why, but Ritter was written off as a guy who was not believable. There were some skeptics who, if you look closely, if you get into the footnotes of the NIE, for instance, at the State Department, their Office of Intelligence and Research was skeptical about the nuclear stuff. The Nuclear Regulatory Administration was also skeptical that these, what were they, those rods that had been imported by Iraq could be used to make a nuclear weapon. So there were in the bureaucracy skeptics, but their voices weren't loud enough and strong enough to undermine the NIE enough to take away the buttresses, shaky buttresses though they were, of the statement that there are stockpiles of bugs and germs there. Yes.
Three names. Hans Flex, who kind of agreed with Ritter. And why didn't the press put him into a position of knowing something? Also, Leo Strauss in the Cabal. If you know, I don't know that much about it.
Yeah.
And the last name is God. And,
Yeah? God has to do with everything, but what do you...
okay. The reason I bring up God is because I have read where George Bush, in a meeting, suggested to the people within the meeting that God told him to invade Iraq. And if we're at that level, I mean, maybe we should be meeting in the theological seminary or something.
Well, let's start with,
How is this president affected that directly by his strong belief in following the word of God?
yeah. Well, let's start with God and work down to Blix. There's no question that Bush is deeply religious, that his faith helped get him over his alcoholism, which was the most important turning point in his life until he became president, really, until 9/11. And I don't think he's in any way insincere about his faith. He reads books of sermons in the morning. And it's also true, I think, that after 9/11, he has said this, that he felt called upon, that everybody has their place and their purpose, and that God's purpose for him was to stand tall and lead us against evil. All of that can be a little unnerving to a secular world. I'm not sure what I make of it. I don't think that Bush thinks he's got a direct line to God. I don't think he's sitting there taking orders at night. I really don't. I think he is praying for, as I think many of us did, he is praying for the courage and the fortitude to live through difficult times. This is a guy who wasn't absolutely ready to be president and had that look in his eyes of, I'm not absolutely sure I'm supposed to be here. And all of a sudden, this cataclysm happens, and actually, thank God he found the strength somewhere, from God or wherever, to do a pretty good job, I would say, in those early weeks. I don't know about you, but when I listened to that speech, I think it was 11 days after 9/11, that was one hell of a speech. And it reassured me that he was taking this seriously, and he was going to act, and he was going to do something about it. And I found comfort and heart, and I think millions of Americans did. I know they did, just judging from his approval rating, which was like 92% after that speech. So I think he was a genuine leader, whether he was getting it from God or someplace, or his wife, who knows, or some combination of the two. Who knows? And I don't really care in a way. I mean, because I don't think he's sort of literally taking commandments from God. I really don't. I think he's just looking for moral assurance to help him to do the right thing. I'm not as disturbed by this as some people are. Let's see. Blix. Why didn't we give more credence to Blix? I think there was an assumption that our own intelligence services knew more than they did. That those, UN types, what do they really know? They're just a bunch of bureaucrats, hand-wringing UN. They don't really want to get anything done. Whereas our intelligence services have this secret stash of knowledge, which they're probably not sharing with the UN, but that's where the real stuff is. I think a lot of people just felt that viscerally in the press, actually, as well as in the government. I didn't hear a lot of dissent from that really anywhere. I mean, the Democrats wanted to essentially go through the UN and stick with the UN process, but there was a lot of skepticism about the UN inspectors because they had appeared sort of feckless in 97 and 98 before they were thrown out by Saddam. In retrospect, they were probably doing a pretty good job. But at the time, it seemed like they were just going through the motions, and Saddam was jerking them around, and easy to fool them, and they were just loosing the football, and that the real information was sitting in some safe someplace at the CIA. Turns out not to be true. Turns out that the UN was probably, guys were doing about the best they could, and we weren't going to do any better. Now, who's the third?
Leo Strauss.
Leo Strauss. Whoa, we're getting even weirder here. Leo Strauss, as some of you know, was a philosopher who gave rise to a movement, the Straussian movement. I've never quite understood all it stood for, but I think one of the ideas of the Straussians is that it's a very aristocratic view that only an elite knows best. The Straussians believe that the philosopher kings, essentially, this all comes from the ancients, that you need philosopher kings to make the real decisions, and they can't really level with the public. In fact, they have to sometimes lie a little bit with the public because the public can't really take the truth, can't stand the truth. And so that this little core group needs to make decisions for the rest of us. That is a sort of I think, a kind of a clumsy and overbroad reading of what's the real Straussians tell me. Well, it's more complicated than all that. But it's useful for conspiracy theorists. Americans love conspiracies. We're still trying to figure out who killed JFK, who killed Lincoln, and all that. And so I think it's a bit of a red herring. It is true. It's an interesting coincidence that in the Defense Department and around the White House there are a few Straussians, and they do know each other. But there are also a few Princeton guys. So yes.
One of the interesting contentions of the security of the intelligence community since 9/11 has been that they have actually foiled war terrorist plots. That Homeland Security is actually working, and I want to ask you whether you believe this to be the case, and if so, how do you get the information? Because they say they can't tell you about the successes. How do you report on it?
Oh boy, this is an old. Richard Helms, who was for a long time the head of the CIA and sort of a grand old man of intelligence. I used to have a lunch with him about once every 3 or 4 months, and it consisted mostly of me buying him lunch, and I didn't learn anything. And he would always say to me, "You never hear about our victories; you only hear about our defeats." Well, I will tell you that I wrote a book about the early years of the CIA, and I got access to their historian's office for some documents. And I was in the CIA historian's office, which, like everything in the CIA, is secret. Secret historians writing secret histories. But I was there when the request came down from the 7th floor, from the director's office, to provide 10 examples of 10 CIA victories in the 1950s in the Cold War. And the head historian laughed because they couldn't come up with 10. So I think that's one of those pat phrases which is easy answer, but often not true. Now, on the specifics, there's no question that they've had some success. I mean, after all, we haven't been attacked. We could get attacked tomorrow, but we've been 2.5 years, and that's something's going right here. And maybe Al-Qaeda is weaker than we realized, but they did manage to organize a pretty impressive job on September 11, 2001, so they're not hapless. We have, as you know, picked up some big fish. Bush keeps this little list in his desk drawer, literally, of the top 30, and he crosses them off when we catch one. And Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who we got about a year ago, that was a big catch because he was their operations guy. And that was part CIA, part Pakistani police, and hugely important. So there's a victory. I'm sure there are some others, but I'm not holding my breath for the book that tells us about all the victories that we didn't know about. I think there have been some. I hope there have been some. I hope there keep on being some that we don't know about. But my experience tells me it's not a huge number, not a huge amount. Yes?
Just to turn the topic a bit, I can think of 2 instances. One was in the FBI, I think it's Robert Hansen, who was a mole or a spy for other governments, and was there for a very long time without being identified. I believe also in the CIA, somewhat earlier, there was another individual who gave out very important information about
Aldrich
Ames,
Ames.
I think in Russia and other places.
Aldrich Ames.
Would you mind commenting on that? I've heard nothing since. It doesn't seem to get above the radar, but it seemed to me to be an awfully important story and a significant kind of finding within our own services that can be very serious and detrimental to the United States security.
I actually think that Aldrich Ames and Hansen got a hell of a lot of publicity at the time. I think 4 books have been written about each one. I know I've reviewed a couple of them. How serious were those penetrations? Well, Aldrich Ames, pretty serious. He burned 10 of our assets in Moscow. That was pretty much everybody we had. That was pretty damn serious. Hansen, the FBI guy, I think a little bit less so, although he had access to a lot of information. But my memory of the damage assessment was it wasn't mortal to our national security. There are always trade-offs here. For a long time, the chief mole hunter in the CIA was a fellow named James Jesus Angleton. And during his watch, they were just unbelievably vigilant looking after moles. But there was a theory that he went too far and that he was a witch hunter, and they ran off some good people, and they created a sensation of paranoia inside the service, and it made it hard to recruit assets, and that Angleton was too good at his job. Now, Angleton became a raving alcoholic paranoid himself and finally got forced out, and things got looser, and sure enough, we got a couple of moles that we know about. There are probably some that we don't know about. But I never got the feeling that because of that, that there's any sense that our security was betrayed in any profound way. I mean, even Ames, all his assets got rolled up. Okay, those were spies, but they were mostly spying on the KGB. There's a lot of spy versus spy. A lot of it is just one spy service spying on the other spy service. It's not like they're stealing our nuclear secrets. Now, they did steal our nuclear secrets in 1946. I mean, it has happened. The Russians stole the bomb, or stole the secrets that allowed them to build a bomb. So it can happen, but I've never read anything or heard anything that would make me believe that our secrets have been compromised in any kind of horrific way since then. Yes.
You sort of talked about outsourcing in the CIA by buying from the Jordanians or the Pakistanis or whomever. That seems to be an increasing phenomenon, not only in that world, but in the Defense Department, whether you're talking about Halliburton or other things that are purchased. And would you comment on that and how that impacts maybe some of the intelligence gathering and reporting that comes in when contractors are performing half the functions that the Army uses for?
We've always outsourced in the intelligence world, and shared with the British, but we've always had to use other intelligence services to do our work for us. So that's not new. We use the West German, we use the French, we use the British, we used anybody we could in the Cold War. The one thing we had was cash. We spread around a lot of dough. And the Brits used to love it because they would, for instance, the overthrow of the Shah, or the installation of the Shah, the overthrow of Mossadegh, was essentially a British operation. We provided the cash, they provided the smarts and the assets. The famous tunnel in Berlin was especially American finance, but it was a British idea. So for a long time, it would be British ingenuity and American money. So there's a long history to this. It's tough to get away from because we have a hard time producing our own spies who are credible spies. Americans don't make very good spies when you think about it. They're indiscreet and interestingly, for a period in the 80s, the CIA was recruiting a lot of Mormons. Most unlikely spies you could think of, and yet they had language skills and they traveled a lot, and they were loyal and decent and dependable, but they just weren't very good at going into bars, which is where a lot of spying gets done.
How about the defense of the Halliburton phenomenon?
Well, I think we've been outsourcing there forever too. I mean, there are only a very few big companies that can provide all the tremendous support services that foreign armies need. So I'm not particularly shocked or surprised by it. Is Halliburton overcharging us? I mean, they may be, but I must say the Halliburton stuff gets to me a little bit. This idea that Dick Cheney threw these contracts to Halliburton there's just no evidence for it, and Cheney would be out of his mind as vice president to steer contracts to Halliburton. I just don't think it happened. It's a familiar refrain. Oh, the vice president fixed it so Halliburton could get these contracts. Halliburton gets these contracts because there are only about 2 people who can even bid for them. Some of them aren't bid for at all, but there's just a limited number of companies that can do this kind of thing. I don't think that Cheney had anything to do with it at all, because he'd be nuts to stick his oar in. Now you can argue, well, he didn't need to. Everybody just knows that fixes in, but I don't really think it works that way. I don't think Cheney had anything to do with it.
Well, I was just going to say, when you were talking about the start of the Iraq War and why it was made accounting, but you didn't mention anything at all about the Project for a New American Century and the history behind that. And the other thing I was going to just mention is that there's a video put out by MoveOn.org, and they have quite a few people who are quite high up in the CIA saying that a lot of the intelligence that was being given to the government wasn't the intelligence they wanted, and unfortunately what happened with Valerie Plame and Joseph Wilson, some of the things, if you could address some of those issues.
Yeah, Valerie Plame. Actually, that shows one of the weaknesses of the press. It is true that the CIA, trying to get to the bottom of whether Iraq was buying yellow cake uranium in Niger, there have been reports of that, but they were trying to find out if it was true, sent over Ambassador Wilson to try to find out, and he poked around a little bit and wrote a report saying no evidence of it. And the Vice President's office and other places in the administration wanted to discredit that report. And somebody, possibly in the Vice President's office, possibly in the National Security Staff, said to the columnist Robert Novak, well, the CIA's got this report, but there's this report floating around, but this guy's just got the job because his wife worked for the CIA or in the Counterproliferation Office. Now, the effect of this was to out an undercover agent because actually Valerie Plame, Ambassador Wilson's wife, was what they call a NOC, under non-official cover. And so it was a serious thing. I suspect that it was a little bit of an accident. They didn't mean to destroy her career or put her at risk. They were basically, it was just somebody bitching that Wilson only got the job because he was married to somebody who worked at the CIA, and that person didn't even know that Valerie Plame was a NOC. Knew that she was working as she was in the Non-Proliferation Center at Langley, but didn't know that she was also an undercover agent. The press this is one of the problems with this access journalism, is that guys like Novak are looking for any little tidbit they can get, and he got used in this case to try to discredit Wilson. So this is the case of the press getting used. Now there's a leak investigation going on, trying to get to the bottom of it. One thing that's driving it, though, I should say, is Ambassador Wilson is a huge hot dog and never met a camera that he didn't head straight for, and has exaggerated and inflamed this whole thing, I think, and blown it out of proportion because he's a publicity hound, and he's always posing in convertibles with his wife with sunglasses on, and I mean, and for Vanity Fair, I mean, the whole thing is just over the top. So it's sort of a classic Washington story where everybody's to blame, but it's maybe not as much of a conspiracy as it first appeared. In other words, not a conspiracy in the sense that I don't think that the Vice President's office was trying to get her killed or to do, strip the veil off of an agent. I think it was more of an accident as they were trying to discredit this report. You mentioned what's it, the project?
For New American.
Yeah, remind me, what is that again?
That was, there were a group of people in the government, I don't know if they were all government, but I know Jeb Bush he signed this.
Oh,
and back in 1997,
Yes,
they
yes.
wanted Clinton to invade Iraq because they feel.
Right. There was all through the 90s a group of neocons, these neoconservatives, some of whom are Straussians, who were agitating to go into Iraq. Now, there's a whole complicated conspiracy theory about that they're really doing the bidding of Israel, that Israel's interests are to have a defanged Saddam, because there was some fear that Saddam would invade Israel, and that the sort of conspiracy theory is that they're really serving the interests of Israel and not the United States. This little group of neocons. This is a smear. I don't think it's true, for one thing. It has the usual anti-Semitic overtones, but it is believed in some corners. I think the truth is that these neocons wanted to get rid of Saddam for a long time. They really thought he was a threat to us and to the region. that and believed in their hearts that a democratic Iraq was necessary and achievable if you could just get rid of Saddam. They may have been over-optimistic about that, certainly how easy it was. And it's not going to be easy, hasn't been easy, it's a mess. Now that doesn't mean it won't still happen. But so there were people agitating for that for a long period of time, and they had signatures on various letters. And there was a famous letter in 1998, I believe, that was signed by people like Jeb Bush, of conservatives, neocons, the people who later got jobs in the Defense Department and the Vice President's office, and were the most vigorous prosecutors of our war policy. Paul Wolfowitz, Scooter Libby in the Vice President's office. They're scattered around the government in key jobs, and they do have influence. Yes?
Yeah, you had mentioned earlier about one of the reasons you went to war was you wanted to show the force of the American military. How effective do you think that's been, especially with the political campaign coming up now, and that the issue of maybe pulling out of Iraq is becoming a political topic?
That's a good question, and it very much the election hangs in the balance. I mean, really, this comes down to do you believe that Bush did the right thing using this force that he really did, in addition to just getting rid of Saddam, send some message of American force that Libya and Iran and North Korea and Al-Qaeda and all of our enemies are suddenly paying attention to and are knocked back on their heels by and a little less scared of us now. If you believe that, you're probably going to vote for George Bush. If you don't, you think it's just a big mess and it's cost us a lot of blood and treasure and a lot of American lives and it's all going to turn bad and not make us more secure, you're more likely to vote for Bob Kerrey. So it's a pretty critical question. Excuse me, wrong Kerry. Sorry.
There's a recent report that the German intelligence provided the name of one of the pilots to the CIA 6 months before 9/11. In the past, we've had some exposés by the FBI agents about the lack of bureaucracy within the FBI to respond to information that they had. How are you sure that the problems with the CIA are not an entrenched bureaucracy rather than the difficulties of doing their job?
Well, there's definitely a problem in CIA FBI communication, or was. Huge historic rivalry, foolish turf battles between those rival agencies, going all the way back to J. Edgar Hoover and the creation of the CIA. After all, Hoover was against creating a CIA or an intelligence service after World War II, and they've been fighting ever since. Up to 9/11, those problems were severe. They would occasionally try to remedy them, but they wouldn't. And the CIA was a secretive place. Everything's compartmentalized. Just didn't share information with the FBI. They considered them to be FBI agents to be a bunch of dumb flatfoots, and they'll misuse this information. And the FBI was just as bad. It didn't share with the CIA, and that was came a cropper not just with this al-Marwi, but there are a number of leads to a couple other conspirators. It's already proven a couple of other conspirators that the CIA knew about, but didn't tell the FBI about. One of these hijackers that they had on the CIA, that the CIA had been warned about, was living in San Diego. His phone number was in the book. He was not hard to find, but because of this wall, there was poor communication. Now, since 9/11, communication has improved. I wouldn't say it's perfect, but there are FBI officials now in the Counterterrorist Center over at CIA. The whole FBI is going through a slow, painful evolution to become more of an intelligence-gathering organization as opposed to a law enforcement organization. So they're inching their way in a slow, bureaucratic, painful way towards a better melding of these two services. I think there's still an argument that there should be the equivalent of the British MI5. We should have a separate internal security agency that just does counterterror, just does intelligence, and does not do any other law enforcement. The FBI should go off and do fraud cases, bank robberies, mobsters, which they all did pretty well before 9/11. Just FBI do that, create a separate internal security organization. The reason why we haven't done that is the United States is a democracy, an open society, and we're uncomfortable about having the sort of internal security operation that, say, France has. They have a pretty strong internal security. They tend to have a lot of buggers and tappers and be very secretive and want to look through your window, and it just makes Americans nervous to have that kind of separate organization. My guess is that if we get attacked again, we're going to have an MI5 for sure. And so now you may ask, why is it any better to have 3 organizations instead of 2? Why don't we just need 1? But my guess is that it will be like this British Secret Intelligence Service with MI5 and MI6 closely linked, one doing foreign intelligence, one doing domestic intelligence, and then a separate FBI. Some of this is just moving the boxes around the flow charts and doesn't make any difference, but there is an argument that we need to go down that route to get at this problem you talked about, entrenched bureaucracy that don't talk to each other.
Well, not just talking about, but not talking to each other. Within the organization, the bureaucracy of the different levels and passing information and people having fiefdoms. Since we don't know how the CIA operates, but we've gotten a little glimpse of the FBI and some of the problems they have moving information within the organization, why should we not suspect that the CIA is hampered by the same sort of bureaucraticness?
It's a fair question. The short answer is urgency. I mean, these fiefdoms break down under pressure, and the pressure of 9/11 was pretty intense. Now, whether they get built back up again is a tougher question, but the assets were just, the CIA consisted of different regional bureaus, regional offices essentially, and a weak counterterrorist center that would draw from all of them, but it was weak. The real chieftains were in the Near East Division or the Far East Division or the African Division, and they didn't always cooperate very well. They would have the information would be stovepiped, as they put it, and compartmentalized. It would separate stovepipes that wouldn't talk to each other. Since 9/11, that counterterrorism group in the middle has gotten much stronger and is more able to reach into the other divisions and pull information out. So I am told, I don't know how reliably, that a lot of these bureaucratic bottlenecks or stovepipes have been broken down, and there is much better sharing because of the urgency of the threat. I mean, we just cannot afford a biological or nuclear attack on an American city, and that's a pretty powerful incentive to overcome bureaucratic rivalry. That's not to say that there isn't some bureaucratic rivalry, it's just better than it was. Way up there.
How much of what happened is because the Brits were saying the same thing, and the press therefore was more willing to accept, when I'm talking about WMD and so on, that is how much of the fact that the Brits were supposedly pros with MI5 and so on influenced the press to be much easier going on this whole issue than it would have been, and is that still a problem?
I think we were more awed by the Brits in the old days. I don't think we were particularly impressed. I mean, it was not insignificant that they were saying the same things that we were, and it's true that the Brits have a better history of human intelligence than we do, but I think that's dated. I think most of the British information was coming from the same assets, or a few assets that we had. It was all pooled and shared. There is a joint intelligence center where we share a lot with the Brits, and I think it's all the same stuff. So I don't really think that we were unduly influenced by the Brits.
I mean the government, I mean the press.
I don't think the press was either, really. I didn't feel that way. I think most reporters who cover intelligence know that British intelligence is not what it once was. James Bond movies notwithstanding. Yes?
Everybody seems to forget that in March of 1993, we were attacked. And there, but for the grace of God, excuse the expression, the World Trade Center, at least one of those towers, would come down.
Right.
Now, why was that so quickly forgotten? And in particular, why did the press kind of forget it?
Because it didn't go down. Because it didn't happen. and
What
we
about
just didn't.
what about the blowback feature? I mean, '93 attack was done by, in part, by groups that had connections with U.S. intelligence before, when the U.S. was trying to fight the Russians in Afghanistan. We were funding money to many of these groups that then turned against us.
Yeah. There is a blowback theory. Blowback is an intelligence term meaning that you go out and you fund some rebel group, or you give them Stinger missiles, and all of a sudden they're using those Stinger missiles on you. And the fear here is that when we help create the Mujahideen in Afghanistan to go after the Russians, in the late 80s and early 90s, we created this Islamic holy war force that blew back and attacked us. I think the evidence is murky on that. I remember looking into this, and there are some tenuous connections. I think there was a community of jihadists in New York that pulled off this '93 attack, and they had some connections to the jihadists in Afghanistan, but it wasn't as clear as the movie version would have it. That there's a CIA-funded operation, and we allowed those people. The theory was that the CIA allowed those people to immigrate here, gave them visas and working papers, and let them into this country, and then they attacked us. I think this has been looked into, and it's just it ain't that clear. I'm trying to remember. It's been a while since I've written about
Saeed
this.
Nazair, Sheikh Umar Abdul Rahman, his visa was written by a CIA officer in Sudan.
Yeah, I know what you're talking about, but my impression the last, and there's been a long time since I wrote about this, 2 years. My impression was that the evidence just wasn't that clear. I remember wishing that it would be simpler for the story if I was writing it, if it was crystal clear. But I remember thinking, this is murky and shifty, and it's hard to get your arms around.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
There's, as we try to rationalize what happened here, the one question that's never answered is, why do they hate us? And if you read anything from Osama bin Laden, he claims they hate us because of our presence in Saudi Arabia, supporting a corrupt regime for oil, and also our unsurpassed support of Israel. So we can go into Iraq, we can criticize the CIA, we can find all other solutions and rationalize it. At the end of the day, we have to take a stand and solve why they hate us. And nobody is ever able to answer that. We all kind of put our heads under the table and continue to move on.
Well, I think we do ask why they hate. Newsweek did a cover actually called "Why They Hate Us" by Fareed Zakaria after 9/11, which gets into a lot of what you're talking about. It's not just that we're in Israel and in Saudi; it's our whole culture they hate. It's threatening. With the spread of Western culture, the Super Bowl halftime show, if you will, into their world is profoundly threatening to them and to the mullahs and to the young unemployed men who are angry, don't have jobs, and looking for some certainty in their life, so they turn to Allah. I mean, we could pull out of Saudi Arabia. We're not going to because of the oil. We could pull out of Israel. We're not going to do that either. But I think we probably still have a problem with them because Western culture would still be seeping into that part of the world, and there'd still be angry young men, and it's principally men, looking for some outlet for their rage, who turned to terrorism, even if we weren't in those two countries. In any case, we're not leaving Israel because of our historic ties and our moral obligations and for political reasons. It's just not going to happen. And we aren't going to leave Saudi Arabia because we need their oil. So that's the reality. And as long as we're there and as long as our culture is spreading, we're going to have some angry terrorists who want to kill us.
Let's take one more question.
Many members of the press over the last 2 years have said of the Bush White House that they're very clearly told that if they cross the Bush White House, they will have zero access at all, and they say they really have almost zero access anyway. And things like Helen Thomas, after 40 or 50 years in the front row of the press room, being deported to the back because she got a little confrontational with the president. But it just seems that since a few things, since this whole Air Force Reserves brouhaha and a couple of the things surrounding Bush's demise in the polls, It just seems like the press is being much more proactive and confrontive with him. Is that so, or is it just?
Well, on this question of them punishing us, believe me, the White Houses are always mad at you. They're always punishing you. They're always cutting you off. It usually lasts about 2 or 3 weeks, and then they let you back in. So that game's been going on forever. It is true, as I was saying earlier, that this White House has been particularly secretive, and there are some signs that they're getting a little panicky because of their own political situation. But that doesn't mean they're going to change overnight and suddenly start opening up and talking to us in a Clintonian fashion. It's just not Bush's nature and character and personality, nor is it the nature of his staff. It's just not going to happen. At most, we're seeing kind of a nervous reaction to polls, but I just think the White House is what it is, and it's never really going to change.
Also, in general, what's your take on how traditional journalists feel about Michael Moore? I mean, he's certainly doing well with bestsellers.
Yeah, Michael Moore. I mean, he's a gadfly. He's a provocateur. I mean, he's not. He is what he is. He's not a journalist. I wouldn't attach too much credence to some of his claims, but he serves a role in a democracy where 1,000 flowers will bloom. He serves a role. He's out there making trouble, and God bless him. Why not? But people understand that he is what he is. He's not the New York Times. Thank you.
Thank you.
I have one more question.
Yeah, sure.